Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming out. The name of this talk is Fortifying Multi-Cluster Hybrid Cloud Data Lakes using Apache Knox. I'm sorry we couldn't come up with a longer title than this one. All right. So my name is Kiran Maddy. I work at Hortonworks as a PM. I manage a couple of products, Apache Knox, HTTP Search, which is Solr-based. And most of my experience has been in data analytics and security. I'll let Sandeep introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Sandeep More, and I'm an Apache Knox PMC member and a committer. I'm also a senior software engineer with Hortonworks, and I have extensive experience with security gateways and API gateways.
All right, what's on the agenda? So we'll start off by talking about the multi-cluster hybrid cloud data lakes. That's the core theme of this talk. And we'll show you how we bring Apache Knox to bear to secure it. Seeing is believing, so we'll walk you through a demo as well. And then we'll open it up to your questions. All right. Show of hands, how many of you have deployed your data lakes in a hybrid cloud environment? There are not many here, but I need to see a few hands up. All right. You're too shy to say that. All right. So what this table is showing is we have the business needs here, and corresponding to that, there are a few deployment options. Keep in mind that this is not set in stone, and we are not trying to be prescriptive here. You can choose any deployment model that suits your business needs. You can mix it up as well. So if you're looking for compliance, and by compliance I mean compliance with regulations such as HIPAA, GLBA, GDPR, what have you. You can run your sensitive workloads on-prem and non-sensitive workloads in the cloud. If you're looking for flexibility, you can run your production cluster on-prem and test and demo clusters in the cloud. And once you're done testing it, you can move your workloads back to your production environment. Last but not least, if you're looking for cost optimization, you can run your fixed workloads on-prem and variable workloads in the cloud. Again, this is not set in stone. Pick whatever works for your business case. But from what we know, the best practice here is to run your analytics workloads wherever your data is residing. But at the end of the day, what you need to be mindful of is you need a unified security and governance model across your data lakes. And that's very critical here. All right. So keep in mind that security in the cloud is a shared responsibility. All right. If you have used any of these cloud providers, you know that they provide very solid security controls around network isolation, network security, and identity management. I'll not go through all of those, actually, because if you have used any of the cloud providers, you're already familiar with those. In our demo that Sandeep will showcase in a little bit, we'll be using the security controls offered by AWS, the one in the green column. So the fundamental idea here is to take these security controls that these cloud providers offer and layer authentication, authorization, MFA on top of it to secure your Hadoop workloads. All right. If you run your workloads in a hybrid cloud environment, you are bound to face a few challenges. Keep in mind that this is not an exhaustive list by any means. We have handpicked them to limit the scope of this demo. And if you look at the first one, I'll go through each of those. The first one is very hybrid cloud-centric. And the other two are some of the challenges that companies face. And you must have read about it in the news as well. So we thought we should cover it in this demo. Keep in mind that companies have existing investments in Active Directory and their identity management systems on-prem, which they do not want to move to the cloud. All right? And even if you, there are challenges connecting to an on-prem AD from the cloud as well, and I'll talk about it in the next slide. Insider attack. Employees can go rogue. You know it, and this is a persistent problem that companies have to deal with. So the key here is to define authorization policies that align with the security posture of your company. All right, and we'll show that to you in a little bit in our demo. Account hijacking. Hackers can steal your credentials by using sophisticated social engineering. And developers unwittingly store their credentials in the source code in GitHub or in the configuration files. It just happens. You and I have done it in the past. Once hackers get access to your credentials, all bets are off right there. They can access your data lake and start exfiltrating sensitive data or the data of interest. And in our demo, we'll show you how to counter these threats. All right. Now, in this particular slide, I'm showing the challenges that you'll face when you try to connect to on-prem AD from the cloud. So the first option is to do a domain join to an on-prem AD over a VPN. So here, your EC2 instance essentially does a domain join with an on-prem AD. The biggest problem with this option is latency. All right? If you have a chatty application that has to authenticate with an on-prem AD a lot, this option is not viable for that. All right? The second option is essentially replication. So what's done here is you bring up an AD instance in the cloud, maybe on a Windows VM or something like that. And you replicate your AD from on-prem to the cloud. The problem with this is you have to manage 2 identity stores. And there are some security implications also that you need to be mindful of. The last but not the least is using Microsoft Active Directory Federation Services, or ADFS. This is a better option, actually. But the only problem with this is your applications have to be SAML compliant. All right? And the demo that we'll show you in a little bit does not use any of those options. All right, show of hands. How many of you are familiar with Apache Knox? 1, 2, 2, 2, 2. Awesome. All right. OK. So for those who are not familiar with Knox, it's an extensible reverse proxy framework. It can be deployed both in the cloud or on-prem. And we'll show you both the deployment options in our demo. For securely exposing REST APIs, HTTP, and WebSockets, we added support for WebSockets fairly recently. And out of the box, it supports proxying of HTTP services. If you're interested in this, you can look up the Apache Knox website. It has a complete list of services that are supported for proxying. And it also, additionally, it supports authentication services such as PAM, pluggable authentication module, via Shiro provider for LDAP and Unix authentication. It also supports federation providers via Pack4j. There's support for SAML, OAuth, and OpenID Connect. And it also supports SSO across various UIs in the Hadoop ecosystem. If you're interested in it, you can look up the Apache Knox website for all the services that are supported for SSO. And it supports client services also. This is pretty cool, and Sandeep will show it to you in a little bit. It's called the Knox Shell. All right, Apache Gateway is not a firewall. If you don't have a firewall, you don't need Apache Knox. You need prayers. And I mean it. Apache Knox is essentially stateless. So you can set up a load balancer such as Nginx, HA proxy, mod proxy in front of it, and load balance across it in a HA configuration. It is not a replacement for Kerberos. I know you guys hate setting up Kerberos. You guys are smiling, so I take that as a yes. So what Knox does is you can set it up to abstract Kerberos from the web UIs. So you can see the configuration there. Knox is set up as a trusted proxy where the user can do a basic auth with Knox using their credentials. And then Knox would essentially use its key tab to authenticate with the Hadoop cluster. So it uses something called as impersonation, as you see down there, do as John Doe. So pretty cool feature and very helpful. So why Knox? I've covered most of the features in this table, but one that would be of some interest to you would be the TLS termination for non-SSL services. If you want to avoid the performance penalty associated with wire encryption, what you can do is you can configure Knox to serve as a TLS a termination point and not worry about setting up wire encryption for your cluster. All right, and we have also added a few features to simplify the setup and the configuration for the Knox gateway. The Knox admin UI and the service discovery and topology generation framework. Pretty cool features. And that's about it for this slide. All right, we have a very vibrant community across around Apache Knox. Earlier this year, we launched release 1.0. It was an important milestone for us. As you can see from the post down there, the community is very active. And we have a solid list of, you can see up there, a solid list of committers and contributors. And thanks to all our committers. And right now, I'll turn it over to Sandeep. An interesting demo. All right.
Thank you, Kiran. Okay, so the fun part. So in this demo, the way I'll plan this demo is I'll talk through the slides and explain what the demo is about and how and why we're doing this demo, the reasons behind it. And then I'll switch between the client slides and the command line for the demo. Now, the questions that Kiran answered, the questions that Kiran posed, these are the answers that we Apache Knox. So we can authenticate users without moving them to on-prem. Without moving your on-prem LDAP to cloud. We can do this using Knox Federation. We can keep unauthorized users from accessing your customer data using the Knox's authorization framework, and we can protect clusters from stolen credentials using Multi Factor Authentication on Knox. As a note, Knox does not have out-of-the-box support for multi-factor authentication, but what Knox can do is Knox can connect with the hook up with the services that support multi-factor authentication. So for the demo, we'll be showing how Knox can connect with Okta, which uses multi-factor authentication. Brief primer on Knox providers. So what are Knox providers? Knox providers are part of Knox topologies. Knox topologies are, think of them as configurations. They have your authentication providers, they have authorization providers, and then they have a bunch of services. Your authentication and authorization are applied on those services, and providers are basically part of a topology. Now, providers add new features to the gateway, and these features are used by all the services. So these authentication and authorization providers are shared by all the services that are defined in a topology. Knox also supports multiple authentication and authorization providers. So in this example, I'm showing one example for Knox Federation and one for authorization provider. But we have for authentication, like Kiran mentioned, we have we can have Shiro LDAP, we have SSSD, we have Knox SSO, we have JWT provider. And for authorization, we have Ackles Auth, we have Ranger Knox plugin. For this demo, we'll be using header-based pre-auth and LDAP authentication. For the on-prem Knox, we'll be using LDAP. So when the users come in, they authenticate to the LDAP using the LDAP authentication. And on the cloud side, we'll be using the header-based pre-auth. That's where the federation happens. And for the authorization, we'll be using the Ackles Auth provider, and this is a sample config. And what this config basically tells us is, it tells us that for the Hive service, only users who belong to the sales group can access that service. And you can have multiple options. So you can limit the service access based on users, groups, and IP addresses. In this case, we have any user who belongs to sales group from any IP address can access the Hive service. Okay. Now, Knox Cloud Federation. Now, this effort is a part of KIP 11 cloud use cases, and the work is done under Jira Knox 1339. So if you're curious, you can look it up and help us. And also for this demo, I'll be showing JDBC with Knox Shell for demo, and I'll be using Knox line, which is basically a combination of Knox Shell and a GUI script. And in the GUI script, I'll be using JDBC to connect to Knox, and then which connects to Hive. This is an example of Federation dispatch. What it does is, basically it's a header pre-auth Federation dispatch. That's the one that actually goes and docks with the Knox in the cloud, and we'll be using SSL. For this demo, we'll be using 3 personas. We have Michelle, we have Kate, and we have Maximus. Now, Michelle is part of the sales group, and Michelle has access to the cloud cluster, demo cluster. Now, I'll be using this cloud and demo interchangeably. And Kate has access to, Kate belongs to the DevOps group, and she has access to production and demo clusters. So and she has access to both the clusters. And Maximus is an adversary who tries to harvest Kate's credentials and tries to exploit the resources. This is the demo architecture that I'm using. I have 2 Hadoop clusters. One is installed on OpenStack, which is an on-prem production cluster where my production data is housed. And I have the demo cloud cluster, which is in AWS. And that's where my QE demo data will be housed. And both of the, these clusters are connected to Knox through 2-way SSL. And the VPC policies on the cloud AWS clusters are such that it only lets, only port 8443 for Knox is open, and only the connections from the from my production cloud are can talk to that cluster. And also, it is extremely critical to have a firewall around your on-prem Hadoop cluster. And for the demo, what I'll be doing is I'll be connecting to, so all the users and all the examples I'll be showing, they'll be connecting through the production on-prem Knox, and depending on the path, they'll be either directed to the on-prem cluster or they'll be directed to the cloud cluster. Okay, and I'll be going through 4 different scenarios. Bless you. This will be scenario number 1. In this scenario, we have user Kate. Now, Kate belongs to the DevOps group, and she is trying to access the local cluster. Now, since she belongs to the group, she can easily access, she has all the permissions to access the local cluster. So she uses Hive JDBC. I'll be using Knox line. She'll be connecting to Knox, and then Knox will authenticate her, and then authorize her. And if authentication and authorization go good, then the request will be dispatched to the Hive process, and then the response will be again sent back to Kate. So I'll be moving to my command line. That's fine. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, that's fine. No, I think that should be fine. I just have to play this dance looking there. So this is an example of Knox line. What Knox line is basically, it's Knox shell, and it's just using a GUI script. And if you're interested about Knox line, just Google Knox line. Larry has an amazing blog written on how to use Knox shell you use to connect the JDBC with Hive. So what I'll be using is, I'm using Knox line, and I'm using this on-prem Knox host name and Knox port, and this is the path that I'll be using to connect to the local, to the on-prem cluster. Now notice the default, that path connects to the, that path basically tells Knox to route the request to your local on-prem cluster. So let's connect, and I also have, I'm tailing the on-prem logs in this window. So just we see what's happening. Oh, like the window?
The window. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, so let's try to connect. Okay, and I'm logging as Kate. Okay, I'm logged in, and let's look at the logs. Now here we can see that the request came through, and Kate was logged in. Can we see the groups? Okay, yeah, we can see the groups that Kate belongs to. Kate belongs to DevOps and Sales, so Knox computed those groups, and based on those groups, our authorization filter kicked in, and basically the access was granted, and the request was dispatched. So let's see if Kate can see any tables. Now, since this is a local database, you can see customer data, so this is just one table. But you get the idea that she has access to the customer data. Now let's go back to. This is scenario number 2. Now here we have Michelle. Michelle has only access to the AWS cluster. Now she does exactly the same thing as what Kate did. She comes in and she connects to the Knox instance, on-prem Knox instance, and she logs in. And she will be authenticated using the on-prem LDAP, just like Kate. So she gets authenticated with on-prem LDAP, and then Knox does the authorization. And if the authentication and authorization are successful, then the request will be dispatched to the cloud Knox cluster, and where the header-based pre-auth will kick in, and then the response will be, and then the request will be dispatched to the cloud Hive process, and then the response will be basically sent back to the on-prem Knox, back to Michelle. Now notice that the path that Michelle is using has cloud in the path. That tells Knox to dispatch the request to the cloud AWS cluster. Let's go to the command line and see this. Now, I'm also tailing the logs for my AWS cluster, just so that we can see in real time when she logs in. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll just change the path from default to cloud. Okay, I'll log in as Michelle. Okay, now let's look at the local Knox first. Okay, here we can see. Okay, let's go all the way down. Okay, here we can see that Michelle is logged in, and Michelle belongs to the group sales, so she has access to the cloud cluster, and the request was dispatched by Knox. Let's look at the AWS logs. In the AWS, we can see that Michelle logging in, and the request was processed with status code 200. Now let's jump back and see what Michelle has any access to tables. Okay, since this is a demo cloud cluster, Michelle can see the demo data, and so she has access to the, so this is how Michelle would come in and access the cloud cluster coming through on-prem Knox instance. So let's go back to the slides. Now this is a scenario 3 where Michelle, who is a legitimate AD user, and she tries to access the production cloud cluster, which is the on-prem cloud cluster. She does not have access to that cluster, but she tries to access it, and we can use Knox authorization rules to prevent that from happening at the Knox level. So this is scenario number 3. Just as before, Michelle tries to log in, but instead of going to cloud, she'll try to go to default. She'll be authenticated using the local LDAP, and based on her groups, she won't be authorized because she does not belong to the DevOps group, and so the authorization will fail. and the request will be, and basically Knox will prevent the request from going through. So let's jump to the command line. Okay, and let's go and hit the local cloud, and let's log in as Michelle. Okay, we can see that the request was stopped, and we can see the error response 403, which is forbidden. Let's look at the logs and see what happens. Now here you can see that Knox has authenticated Michelle, and we can see the groups. Michelle belongs to sales group. If I can just see that. Okay, yeah, there it is. So she gets authenticated, but then the authorization filter kicks in, and it basically says, nope, you don't have access, and the access, and you can see the access granted is false, and the request is stopped at that point. So this is how the Knox authorization framework can be used to prevent, to basically enforce authorization based on groups. And you can do this at the service level, or you could do it at the service level, or you could do it at the cluster level. Now this is the fourth and the last scenario, which is the Maximus. Maximus is an adversary in this case, and what he tries to do is he tries to harvest Kate's credentials using social engineering. And once he has Kate's credentials, which is username and password, then he could just go in and log in and basically exploit the resources. So how can we stop Maximus, or how can Knox help here? So one of the things Knox could do is by using multi-factor authentication. So in this example, we'll be using Okta. Okta has support for multi-factor authentication. Knox, again, does not have out-of-the-box support for multi-factor authentication, but for this demo, what we'll be showing is that Knox can hook up with services such as Okta, which support multi-factor authentication, and then you can leverage that. So let's okay, if I can just find my mouse. For this demo, I'll be using Knox admin UI, just because it's easier for me to demo this. Now, my Knox admin UI is hooked up with Okta, so that when Knox sees that the user is not logged in, it will see for any what's authentication. What authentication is configured. In this case, it's Knox SSO and Okta, so it will try to take me down that path. Okay, so let's accept a secured certificate here, and you can see we got redirected to Okta. Now let's log in using Kate's credentials. So say Maximus has Kate's credentials, and he tries to log in. Okay. Okay. Do that. And there you can see the multi-factor prompt shows up. So if now Maximus has to have a multi-factor, Kate's phone, or any factor. In this case, I'm using Google Authenticator as a second factor. But any factor, it could be text, it could be voice call, it could be Google Authenticator, whatever is configured. Maximus has to have that. So to demo, if you have anything, it'll fail. But anyway, so this is one of the ways, if you want to protect your sensitive credentials, this is one of the ways you could do that. So pretty much, basically, that's all I had for the demo. I'm just time.
Open it up for
let's open it up for questions.
Yeah. We have Larry here, who is the PMC and chair for Apache Knox, and we have Phil, who is the PMC for Apache Knox as well. They'll help us field questions. Yeah, go ahead. Can you use the mic, please?
This one? Oh, yeah.
This one?
Yeah, that works.
Question is for the authorization controls. What's the difference between using Knox authorization or Ranger authorization? Like, is it the same thing, or how could it be used together?
Okay, good question. Kiran, you want to take a stab at it?
So for this particular demo scenario, I think the Knox authorization is pretty suitable. The Knox authorization is limited to authorization at the service level, essentially, for the services that are supported by Knox. If you want anything beyond that, full-blown authorization support, then you should go with Ranger.
So basically, if you have services that are configured to Knox, so in this case, I showed that everything like Kate, Michelle, everybody comes to Knox. So in that case, you can use Knox authorization framework. But if they're not coming to Knox, then, I mean, that would not work. So in that case, you could use Ranger. So, yeah.
I'm not sure if that was exactly clear. So
Larry, here.
if you don't protect it in other ways, and there are other channels to get to the same data, you know, an ACL in Knox isn't going to protect that data. That's perfectly valid, and there are definitely reasons to do so. It's a centralized place for your authorization policy, which makes a ton of sense. So for demo purposes and for smaller installations and deployments, the Knox authorization provider is sufficient, but it's not really meant to be, you know, enterprise class policy management kind of scenario. Does that make sense?
Thanks. Thanks, Larry. Any more questions? All good?
Just one?
You did a very good job here. And just one announcement, actually, refreshments are being served in the, what was that, Expo?
I think at the Expo.
Yeah, the Expo Hall, yeah, at 3:30, actually. Cool, all right, thank you so much.